what I like to say is that when logic is not present, entanglement to unresolved trauma is. That people are all the things, right? That they can be kind, loving, gentle, funny, but also be abusive. We talk about in the culture a lot about the word triggered. It's just an incomplete sentence. It's your unresolved trauma is triggered. To be able to be triggered, you have to have unresolved trauma that you haven't dealt with yet. And so rather than dealing with that unresolved trauma, we just amplify it.
Yeah, that's so weird that that's the most emotional part, but it's like that they do love me and support me, and yeah, it was really like I could feel them like standing behind me and like had a hand on my shoulder.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for the courage of going through that process with me.
Thanks for the courage to ask to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the, this healing work is a work of courage. And that's the, at the end of, and we'll talk a little bit about what these family constellation workshops are. But at the end, what usually comes up is how courageous people are to deal with the things that they don't want to see. To see the hidden, the uncovered. Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of feels to me like a lot of, maybe the energy that's going on in the world right now, like that.
Most, the idea in this work is that we're all systems that come from all the previous systems that existed, and that we are a current representation of everything that happened before. With all the good, with all the bad, with all the wins, with all the losses, with the fights, with the loves, with the people that were excluded, with all the victims, with all the perpetrators. And that as we do this healing work, we can reorder and reorganize things in their assigned place. And regardless of whatever circumstances we lived through, we come from two people coming together. Regardless of the circumstances, we all have two parents. To be able to exist in this world, everybody has two people that they came from. And those two people had two people that they came from. And those people had two people that they came from. And there's this beautiful representation that says, 12 generations back, there are 4,094 people in your lineage. And they all had to do the right thing in the exact right moment, in the exact same place, in the exact right place for us to be here today. And it's like we're a gift. We should act like it, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the wars that happen, regardless of the famine, regardless of whatever happened. Life happened. It's a beautiful thing to think about.
Yeah, and all of that is within us, right?
Yeah. Correct. And that's what that meditation is, or the ability to reconnect with that dynamic. Because trauma disconnects us from that dynamic. That's usually what happens, is if we're in a position of unresolved trauma, we take on things that don't belong to us and move away from that position in our family system. We might become the parent of our parents. We may become our parents' partner. We may take the position of a child that was not born. We may take the position of an uncle that was lost in an accident. out of loyalty to our family system.
I feel like it's also acceptance of self.
Yes.
And it's like all those people behind you. Yeah, the excluded ones. All their stories. It's part of who you are. And that is, I think it can be hard for a lot of us to accept who we are. Okay. But I want to hear about your story.
All right. What do you want to? What part about my story?
Well, starting with how you grew up.
So beside my appearance, I'm originally from Venezuela. I was born and raised, and despite my accent, I was born and raised in Latin America mainly. My parents, my father was my dad's Venezuelan, and they met in college in Michigan in the U.S. and fell in love, got married, and my dad worked for Kellogg's, you know, the cereal company.
Mm-hmm.
And we lived in Brazil and Mexico, and then I was born in Venezuela, but then we lived in Brazil and Mexico, and then we ended up in Michigan when I was about 7 years old. And then from there, my father was like, I can't do this the cold, you know, being from a tropical, beautiful country in that time. Venezuela was an extremely affluent and gorgeous country. And he said, we're moving back to Venezuela. So at 7, we moved to Venezuela, and I was like one of those kids that, like, immigrant child, you know. So we spoke English at home, and we celebrated traditional American, you know, holidays, and we spoke Spanish everywhere else. So I went to a Venezuelan school, and I have childhood friends that I've known for my whole life, you know, and my whole dad's side of the family lives in Venezuela. So I have, you know, a huge community that's still in Venezuela. So there's a big story there to tell. And I grew up in a pretty affluent home. And at about 13, my father started having a relationship out of the marriage, right? Stepped out of the marriage. And the conflicts with my father became extraordinarily difficult. Now, looking back on it, I understand that it's a lot of because of his family system and because of my mother's family system. So I understood where that came from. Now I understand where that came from. But at the time, it was difficult, very challenging.
Did you have siblings?
Yes, I have a younger sister, and then I have a sister that I'm 20 years older than, from my father's second relationship. Yeah. And so my sister and I, my sister does family counseling. She's a teacher in Chicago, but does a lot of work in the systemic healing and family constellation work. We started at very similar times. She started, I think, I believe a year before I did, in this work. And we've been just kind of, like I say, working on our shit for all these years, you know, just dealing with our stuff. And, but then, you know, growing up in Venezuela was a pretty typical until, you know, the family broke apart and had to assume the I guess, father figure of the family. My father left the house and said, hey, here's these 2 guns, you know, a shotgun and these 2 pistols. You're now in charge of the house, you know, kind of situation. And he left to be with his newly formed relationship. And during that time, crime in Venezuela was high. And we lived in a very big house, but we were basically house poor. We would have to have, you know, I'd have to like beg the electricity company not to cut off our electricity, you know. And I grew up in a really affluent, you know, society, and so we would be like, no, you know, they would open the refrigerator and we would have nothing and be like, no, my mom's gonna go grocery shopping today, you know, and get some stuff. So it was very much of kind of survival, but house poor is what I think the terminology that people use. And so that was, what was that?
Which part of Venezuela were you
In Caracas, so the capital. Yeah. And it's very, the shame, there's a lot of shame that comes through that. A lot of shame that comes from being able to be in that situation. And I acted out in, violently in fights, rebellious, hanging out with the wrong crowd and just getting into a lot of trouble. And, people would say I was a noble, good kid, but just making stupid decisions, which was kind of accurate. Poor student, very, very bad student in school. Just kind of trying to hustle my way through and figure everything out and scraping by with what little, I had. And, then from there, my mother became a U.S. diplomat for the U.S. Department of Commerce, and that was for us this huge lifeline. My mother started working for the U.S. Embassy, and the majority of the money that she was making was going to pay, for the mortgage, basically, so we didn't, kind of lose the house kind of situation. And we were just like kind of really scraping by. So when my mother got this job as a U.S. diplomat, she was her first I had just finished high school and graduated high school, and she got posted in Mexico, in Monterrey, Mexico. And so I went to live in Mexico. My sister was going to finish high school, and I didn't really have a plan. I was kind of floating. I was adrift, as they would say. And I was, extraordinary. My anger level was extremely high. I was constantly in a rage and very, very difficult to deal with. And in Mexico, I spent a couple of years just adrift, partying, just getting into trouble, partying, not having, doing whatever I wanted, basically. And from there, one of my best friends growing up was in Gainesville, Florida, at University of Florida. And he was like, "Hey man, you should come to Gainesville and do this stuff." And there was a big group of Venezuelans that were going to school in Gainesville and Florida, at University of Florida. And I was like, I should do that. And my cousin had just joined the Navy. And I was like, well, let's go. So McAllen, Texas is about a 2-hour drive, or I want to say maybe 3-hour drive from Monterrey, Mexico. And we would drive up to McAllen, Texas to cross the border and do, shopping in American malls when that was still a thing to do. And we went to a recruiting station for the military, and I saw the Air Force office was empty. I saw the Navy office was full, and I saw the Air Force office was empty, and I walked in and I said, "What's this about?" And I ended up joining the military, and it was one of the best decisions I made. And then spend 8 years active duty in the U.S. military. Yeah.
Did you go on tours?
I was stationed in England for 2 years, and I was stationed just north of Cambridge. You know where Newmarket is?
Yeah, I studied at Cambridge. So
okay, all right. So I was at RAF Mildenhall, which is just north of Newmarket, in 2004. So I spent 2 years in England, and then we were a very operational squadron. So during both wars that were happening, we were supporting the war effort. So I went downrange but in a very different capacity. My job was I was a jet engine mechanic, so I fixed airplanes. That's basically what I did. So I was never, thank God, knock on wood, I was never shot at and never had to be in direct harm's way. It was never in that. But we were doing more support logistics for the war effort in the Middle East that was happening during that time. Mm-hmm. And then from there, I was stationed in Louisiana for 6 years, and then there is just stateside. I was in the nuke world, so that's just very, static, and it doesn't have a lot of movement. And then from there, I left the military.
And so growing up, did you feel like you were more Venezuelan or American?
That's a great question. I was always I've always been very much both. But I would have to do on a regular basis was defend, in some capacity, the American values abroad. So, people would be like, "Oh, this American," you know what I mean? And Venezuelan culture is extraordinarily charming and funny and ribbing and teasing, kind of situation. And so, you constantly have nicknames and whatnot. But Venezuela is very much like the U.S. in that capacity. There was a huge influx of immigrants post World War II from, primarily from, the Civil War in Spain there was a big influx of Spanish, of Spanish people that came to Venezuela. So there was a lot of Spanish Venezuelan families, and then many Italian families and many Portuguese families as well. So there was a huge influx of there was massive opportunity in Venezuela during that time. And so Venezuela became this kind of melting pot of, Venezuela was a Spanish colony. So many people have different, different lineages, right? So many indigenous Venezuelan lineages, as well as Afro-Venezuelan lineages, and also Spanish. And there's a lot of mixing that happens. And my grandfather would say Venezuela is like coffee and, coffee and milk, right? Some people have more coffee and some people have more milk. In a family, you can have, people that are different tones of color in the same family, and it's just everybody's mixed, basically, is what kind of the idea is. So Venezuela has always had this, and getting to the point of your questions, Venezuela has always had this, that's the Italian kid, and then they have the Venezuelan Italian club. And then that's a Portuguese kid that their family are bakers. There's these stereotypes that happen in the culture. And I was, a gringo, like the gringo kid, right? So that spoke English, and I speak English like this, and I speak Spanish. I don't have an accent in Spanish. I speak perfect Venezuelan Spanish and culturally applicable Spanish. And so I lived in both worlds, one foot in and one foot out. But I usually, I grew up in the ideals of what the United States was, of the idealistic of, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and then kind of this beacon of what, freedom looked like and responsibility looked like. So very much of that ilk. My mom's side of the family, which is my American side, my grandfather was, traditional Republican. And I grew up kind of in the middle of just kind of making my own ideas. And Venezuela during that time started very much leaning. Venezuela has always been center-left, as I would call it. People talk about Venezuela being socialist for, like in the last 20 years after Chavez. But the reality is Venezuela has always been center-left. The largest company in Venezuela is public. It's a public company called PDVSA, which is the petroleum company of Venezuela. Also, you can't go to medical school in Venezuela by paying. It's a completely free, government-paid program, right? And produce some of the best doctors in the world and in Venezuela are produced from the national program. Education was 100% free. The literacy rates were some of the lowest in the world. One of the strongest economies in the world was the Venezuelan economy during that time. So it was always, like my great-great-grandfather. So my great-grandfather was one of the founding members of the, let's call it Democratic, center-left party of Venezuela. And it was very much, secular, more liberal-leaning ideas. And then, so I would always defend kind of the American side, right? It was like I would the ideals of conservatism and have those kind of ideas. And then I went through different transitions of what that would look like. But I always felt like I had to represent and defend the ideals of the United States outside of the United States. My mother was very conscious of that always. She's like, how they see you is how they see every American. So it was very much of that. That's how I grew up. So I know a long way of answering your question.
And what were the main issues in Venezuela at the time that you were growing up?
So income inequality became a huge issue in Venezuela. Um, Income inequality was huge. There would be, growing up, there would have the people had everything, literally everything. Private planes. I know that, like, private planes and helicopters is now kind of a common thing. The ultra wealthy from Instagram, you would see that, but during that time, it would be, people would have these massive farms and planes and go to study in Switzerland and, just massive amounts of wealth. And then there were just people that were very poor. But what did happen in Venezuela was that there was upward mobility because of the programs that the government had that actually worked, excuse me. So you could be somebody that was a good student at, a small town in the middle of the country, and you could go to the public universities and get an incredible world-class education. And what happened with my dad is that he got a scholarship to study abroad during that time, during the 1970s, and that scholarship lasted decades. To say they would go abroad to study and then come back to Venezuela. And so that happened, and the Venezuelan infrastructure was strong. There was things were moving, but the income inequality that happened in Venezuela was just too big to bear.
And the massive amount of wealth was from oil money.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. And then was the inequality along lines of race or class or certain groups?
Venezuela has always been classist, I think, because that mixing is so prominent. There are some racial undertones to the country, but it's primarily class. If you have money, that's the thing that matters. That's the thing that matters over anything, is just really those the money aspect. Or it used to be very merit based in some capacity as well. It's like, man, that guy works for Coca-Cola, or that lady works for MasterCard, and like super like I have a lot of female cousins that are my age, and they're all engineers. They're just extraordinarily prepared, very smart, just powerhouse go-getters. And that was always a point of pride for Venezuela, was the grit and determination of the Venezuelan woman to be able to accomplish things. But on race, much less pronounced as in the United States. The United States has clear lines. Well, for many years had very clear lines between white and black, and Venezuela is just all of it was blurred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I listened to the episode you did with your mum, which is so interesting. Her telling the story of, I thought your dad was a professor when they met, and she was a student.
No. They were he was a Venezuelan, student, but he had, they might be a professor. She thought he was British because he would carry a umbrella everywhere. And yeah, no, he was a student.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, maybe that's what got me. And then and then she was a journalist, right? Or she was a correspondent.
Yes, my mother was a journalist. So when we lived in Michigan, she was on TV. She was an anchor, a traditional anchor. And then when we lived in Venezuela, she was the foreign correspondent, or she was the country, contact for ABC News.
And is your dad still in Venezuela now?
No, he lives here in the United States. Yeah, he came to the U.S. about 7 years ago. And he lives in I live in South Florida, and he lives in Boca Raton. He lives in South Florida as well.
And when's the last time you went back to Venezuela?
So I went back to Venezuela in 2009. That was the last time I was there. So because I was in the military, and because of my mother's position, the political relationship between the United States and Venezuela became very difficult, and I elected not to risk it, to put myself in jeopardy to become a headline. Let's just put it that way. So after the last time that I went, I was, I elected not to go anymore until things got a little bit calmer. And seems like things are a little bit calmer now, but now I have a different equation. I have 2 kids, and I'm married, and I have responsibilities, and I run a company, and I need to make sure that those things are in line, and passage is appropriate. So the equation of any person that comes from a country that's in difficult situation.
And how does it make you feel what's happening or what's been happening in Venezuela?
I'm in many capacities, I think that the root of my interest in systems and unresolved trauma comes from the dynamics that happens in Venezuela. I think that in many capacities, when the victim-perpetrator dynamic gets a hold of a culture, logic leaves the culture, if that makes sense. And so I'm trying to figure out maybe that question for myself, but subconsciously that question for Venezuela, for my country of origin, is to answer that question on a systemic level, to find out how I can help Venezuela heal. So I'm driven by this, now that I think of it, I'm driven by this undercurrent of trying to solve a problem, which is what I ultimately love to do.
And how has that played out from that perspective of victim perpetrator? And I guess how would you explain what's been happening in Venezuela to someone who has maybe no understanding of what's gone on, or a child, or like maybe you have had to explain things to your children? Yeah,
so I'll do kind of like the heady explanation, and then the child explanation. I'll do both of those. In the heady explanation, I believe that when there's unresolved trauma in a culture, people absolve their individual responsibility to the collective. And you saw that happen, and it happens in different degrees, right? And you can see that in Nazi Germany. Carl Jung, in some capacity, said, and I'm paraphrasing here, said that Hitler was the voice of the collective of unconscious of 78 million Germans. It's like the crowd has Hitler as much as Hitler has the crowd. So there's this relationship between the two. That's really interesting. And this is not an original thought, but the thought of mine. But the thought is that this mass perpetratorship came from the victimization of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, right? So it's this humiliation sets the groundwork for this perpetratorship, not justifying it in any capacity, just understanding where it is and where it comes from. And then Maoist China comes from the century of humiliation. And so you see that how big humiliation and like how effective of a catalyst humiliation is in a population. And I think in some capacity, to a lesser degree, it happened in Venezuela. I think extreme income inequality creates humiliation, and it creates fertile ground for revolution. And it's terrifying, because through revolution, people justify atrocities, right? It's like there's no way of being able to look at it from a different perspective. And so I think systemic unresolved trauma in cultures is extraordinarily dangerous. I'm trying to find out in my small capacity, trying to find out a framework where that can be dealt with and identified. And you can even, I'm trying to figure out a way to quantify unresolved trauma in systems and populations. And so that's what it seems like what happened in Venezuela, is because Chavez is a symptom, not necessarily the cause of what was happening in Venezuela. And he was, very charismatic and tapping into that unresolved trauma of the population, of the humiliation that happens when, there's a lot of poverty. And so when you create an us versus them, you can use that as a catalyst to justify whatever atrocities are going to happen. And in the case of Venezuela is that I think there's different flavors of it, right? And flavors might be a colloquial way to put it, but there's definitely different versions of what that dynamic represents. In one dynamic, it represents genocide. In another dynamic, it represents kleptocracy, and that's what's basically happened in Venezuela is that the Venezuelan government is stolen billions of dollars of resources from the country from this perspective of not having enough. And so they've, at least 23, 22 years later, they've become the establishment, and the country is, I was just talking to one of my uncles, is, the production of oil, of barrels of oil of the country has went from 3 million barrels to now 600,000 barrels of oil production. It's just abysmal. And that's the thing that I try to understand the most about those dynamics, and just say it's just understanding the system. And then for my kids, I kind of explain it's like, man, there's difficult situations out there that we can't always explain or that we can't always understand. And Venezuela is in one of those situations, is going through a process that they're trying to figure out. I have a lot of employees in Medellin, Colombia, and so that gives me a lot of hope, because Medellin has gone through this incredible, beautiful transformation from a location in Colombia that was extremely dangerous to this beautiful, thriving ecosystem. So that gives me a little bit of hope that things can always change, and we can always change to do something better and to try to figure out where that comes from. So, yeah.
Because did you witness that in Monterey as well? Or was that, because now that's kind of at the center of drug cartels and...
Yeah, Monterey was odd because when I lived in Monterey, it was extraordinarily safe. It was one of the safest places in Latin America. It was I moved there in 2002, and then I left in 2000. I want to say three or four. I can't remember, but it was extraordinarily safe. Like there was zero crime, and things just catastrophically flipped and changed. And I think the law of unintended consequences happens. They started they started really cracking down and enforcement in Colombia, the cartels, and they broke that down, and they just moved it to Mexico. They moved it closer to the source. So there was this really interesting that the U.S. I remember when I was in high school, and I was always really interested in geopolitics. And I asked somebody, there was this Newsweek article, I think it was a Newsweek article or Time Magazine article. It's like 75% of Colombian drugs go through Venezuela, like leave the country through Venezuela. And that was in 2000. That was in 1999, 2000. I would say 100% now, but that's complete speculation. But, you saw that the DEA came into Colombia and, with military force and, as advisors, really clamped down on the cartel operations in Colombia, and they literally just moved it to Mexico. It's just like closer to the source. It was less risk and closer to the source. And then from there was territorial disputes throughout northern Mexico. So it's just like, this whack-a-mole game that happens. Rather than understanding the source of the trauma, where it's coming from, and starting to deal with it from that perspective, we create this victim-perpetrator dynamic to continue perpetuating the cycle.
Yeah, and what you're saying is just so interesting with what's happening right now with Israel and Palestine, and the point you said about, the atrocities being justified in a revolution or that kind of collective feeling, which is also pretty terrifying to feel that, like in London now, people using those arguments, not just, it's like educated people who have nothing to do with the region using these arguments. So, that's kind of And it's like you feel that, right? Like it really affects the feeling of a city.
So, what I like to say is that when logic is not present, entanglement to unresolved trauma is. And why I say that is that, educated, kind, thoughtful people can do terrible things. That's just a reality, or justify terrible things. I like to say that people are all of the above. That people are all the things, right? That they can be kind, loving, gentle, funny, but also be abusive. That those people, most people are complex bags of things. And so and I think that, we talk about in the culture a lot about the word triggered. It's just an incomplete sentence. It's your unresolved trauma is triggered. To be able to be triggered, you have to have unresolved trauma that you haven't dealt with yet. And so rather than dealing with that unresolved trauma, we just amplify it. And I think in these conversations, you can see somebody that's saying, I've heard these arguments. I live in a predominantly Jewish community. And, some of the most kind, understanding people that I know have deep roots in Israel and come from conflict. And you see this as a triggering of the unresolved trauma that happens because of the Holocaust, that you see the dynamic of the Jewish people, and it's extremely difficult to see and to witness. But that's how I look at it from an untangled perspective. I can say, from my perspective, that I would like peace between the two people, and to understand the further dynamics that are entangling these populations to fight in a constant basis. And I think it all boils down to unresolved trauma.
And do you think, so when you have the people making arguments that I've seen, that this is or some of what we saw in London, like people celebrating on the streets, like that a terrorist attack had happened, or that kind of, that the means justifies the end, and like this is what we have to do to decolonize or whatever, is that those people are tapping into some kind of like feeling of oppression or something that makes them want to like, because it's not like it's the people who are being affected, it's like people who are totally, they're not from the region, they're just like, they've never been there, they don't know, but they strongly want to say, yes, it's right to kill innocent people in order to achieve this thing.
So that's a great question, and it's a really difficult question. And thank you for asking it, because it's not easy to talk about this without, risk. And I think that in many capacities, people that have unresolved trauma sometimes fall into traps. That fall into traps of plights of others. So the same people that resonate with certain movements, that are a victim-perpetrator movement, have some work to do. And so that's the scary part, is that if you almost have an automatic automatic playlist that happens. It's like when you insert unjust situation here, and you will input the same kind of things that happen, right? Does that make sense? Whether that's with Ukraine, the Palestinian-Israel conflict, Black Lives Matter, any situation, right, that happens. What's the Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, any of these kind of social movements that happen on a regular basis, in many capacities, have truth to them, but are taken by the unresolved trauma momentum and create perpetratorship. And that's the scariest thing, is that it becomes, victims that don't deal with unresolved trauma can have a risk of becoming perpetrators when they're older, right? And it boils down to that childhood trauma. And the more childhood trauma you have in a system, or more shame, or more triggers, or more issues that haven't been dealt with, the higher the risk of becoming perpetrators is. And there is a tendency for these structures to become tyrannical in some capacity. And we have to adjust for those things, but not burn the whole thing down.
Mm-hmm. And how would you define unresolved trauma for someone who's never heard that phrase?
So unresolved trauma, and when I talk about unresolved trauma, I usually talk about small t trauma, is what what many people say. And unresolved trauma might be the death of a parent when you were a child, or might be abandonment. It might be a sibling that somebody lost. Might have been an accident. Might have been somebody that wasn't able to connect with their mother because the mother was emotionally unavailable during childhood. It could be a father that was absent. It could be a plethora of dynamics that create a vulnerability in somebody's system. And that vulnerability is what I consider to be unresolved trauma. It's a baseline for activation of triggers. And so there's a good framework. It's called ACE. It's the Adverse Childhood Experiences in psychology. And that gives you a little bit of a framework of what that looks like. But in the work that I do in family constellations, you can see those things manifest on a regular basis, right? And it's something as simple as maybe the child wasn't able to emotionally connect with the mother during the first couple weeks of their life. Or, are you familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He, talks about how the body has a manifestation of unresolved trauma. And so my thought is that if the body manifests unresolved trauma, so does our behavior. So in our day-to-day. And in some capacity, what family constellations and the systemic work shows us is that out of loyalty to our system, we repeat patterns of things that haven't been resolved. And so that's what, in many capacities, unresolved trauma looks like. Like in my family system, what I can speak for mine, is that since my father stepped out of the marriage, and for whatever reason, my parents saw past each other because of the unresolved trauma that they had in their systems. And they both had a part in this thing. It wasn't anybody's fault. It was just, how things played out, basically. And my mother and my sister and I were in this dynamic where we were in an emergency structure, like batten down all the hatches, get into war position because we need to survive through this. And my father was excluded from the family system. So that was simply that I didn't have space to be my own person. I didn't have enough space to create the tools that I needed to be independent. I didn't have the space to be able to create a relationship with another person. And so if you're in emergency, everything's a 10. And you can't right-size things. So my rage, my anger, my reactions to things weren't right-sized. Something that was a 2 was treated as an 8. Something that was a 6 was treated as a 10. In reaction, because it came with all the tumbling things that I hadn't dealt with it. It came with all the things that didn't belong to this conversation. Maybe I didn't get enough, and I was saying I've never gotten enough. Maybe somebody didn't think about me, and I said I need to be seen. And so that's what I look at as unresolved trauma in many capacities. looking at it from the perspective of it's not only the thing that's present, it's everything that comes with it.
So for you, was it that you were forced into this parent role when really you were still a child, or like you needed space still to grow up?
I wouldn't say forced. I said out of loyalty to my family system, I said I'll take because I love subconsciously. Obviously, I'm not saying that I put on a shield and said I am going to take this, but from a subconscious loyalty perspective, I stepped into that role to the partner of my mother. They call that emotional incest. To be the partner in some capacity of consoling an emotional crutch and supporting my mother in a role that was inappropriate. I was the child and she's my mother, we're not equals in this dynamic. I'm the little one and she's the big one. And so being in that position, you take on a lot of things that don't belong to you. So that's, I think, when, if somebody talks about unresolved trauma, a question they can always ask themselves is like, does this belong to me? And if you really sit down and if you still yourself and maybe do a meditation, you're going to ask, does this anxiety belong to me? Does this anger belong to me? And you can find out. In my case, it didn't.
And back to your story of how you ended up where you are now, so as you were growing up, where did you see your life going? Or did you, as you were partying or as you were messing around and getting in fights, did you?
Oh, I didn't. Yeah, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a track. I didn't have goals. I didn't assume responsibility. I was very much in the victim dynamic. And I justified perpetratorship very easily. And that's why I understand the dynamic. Is that I did not good things, to people. And I assume responsibility for that. I was a perpetrator. It's just a reality. I was a victim as well. And I was deeply entangled in that dynamic. And it would be victim and then perpetrator and the victim and the perpetrator and the victim and the perpetrator. That's the difficulty of that dynamic, is that you can justify perpetratorship.
So it's kind of, is it the playground bully thing, like my life's so hard, so I'm gonna take it out on other kids to kind of, and get power that way?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately. Yeah.
And when did you start becoming aware of that dynamic? And I mean, how did it get to the point where you are now, where I imagine you have a lot of compassion for that younger version of self?
I'm more than compassion. I have understanding for him. I just understand now. That's it. With no judgment, I just understand. And I treat him kindly now. With a lot of kindness. You were asking how did I... It's just an awareness that happens. After you continue, this work is hard. It's not I wish I had a magic wand and I could say you can download an app and go through... Did I lose you?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, did I lose you a little bit? I lost you a little bit.
I can still hear you.
Oh, okay. So, I wish there was an app that you could download to deal with this stuff. But I think after a lot of personal work, I came to realize where I was a victim in my system. I dealt with that victimization I dealt with, sexual abuse that happened to me. I dealt with, physical abuse that happened to me. I dealt with emotional abuse that happened. And I understood that as I healed that, my capacity for perpetrator went away. And so it just basically came through a lot of deep work. And so I have kids now, and I want to make sure that I break the cycle for my kids. Not to say that I would perpetrate something on them, but they might find a partner that is a perpetrator because that is still in our family system. Or they may become a perpetrator towards somebody else. And so, you know how they say history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes? That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to lessen the rhyming that happens in my family system. And perpetratorship can be from, just simply being an ass to, murder, right? Or genocide. There's that. And when I talk about perpetratorship, I talk about it in broad terms because it can be, you're just a jerk, right? Or you're just a terrible person, right? Or you can be, Hitler. There's everything in that scale works, right? And I'm just trying to make that scale as, as small as possible. And yeah, do I, would I get angry at somebody that cut me off in traffic? 100%. I'm a human, right? Or if I'm like, but what I try to do is I right size things. It's just appropriate to this scenario. I'm not gonna. If somebody cuts me off, I'm gonna be like, oh. I slightly exhale from my nose when, in the past when I was a young man, I would have, I could have in a capacity gone into full road rage and, like this doesn't belong to me. This isn't right sized from small, small exhalation through my nose and rolling my eyes to full on road rage. Like there's a whole gamut of response in that perpetratorship, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So, that's I kind of forgot what I was going with this, but that's what I'm trying to do is to minimize those things and make them right sized.
Yeah, and I guess once you've done the healing, it no longer feeds into the story of this happened to me because I'm a victim, because people are out to get me, or whatever.
And that's, man, I feel so terrible about saying this, and I really do, because there's me here, and there's me here, right? Intellectually, I know that in some capacities, there's this saying that I love that says, what happened to you isn't your fault, but it's your responsibility to fix it because nobody else can. And so, there's a lot of conversation about victim blaming. It's like, no, but you participated in the dynamic. It's not your fault, but you participated in the dynamic. There was something there that created a closing to be able to participate in that dynamic. And that's so hard to say. And it's so hard to heal. And it's so hard to hear. And I understand. I completely understand. Because you say that to somebody that's been sexually abused, and this is like, it's just so difficult to understand that dynamic. You say, what happened to you wasn't your fault, but you have to heal it, because if not, other generations will, out of loyalty to the family system, carry on a similar dynamic. They won't repeat exactly that. Doesn't mean that you're going to be, but there may be a similar dynamic that happens in your family system. And that's enough risk to incentivize somebody to look at the stuff that they don't want to look at, And the real secret is how prevalent it is in all of society,
And so at what point did you begin the healing work? Like, was joining the military a big change for you to clean up, like, the partying and...
Oh, no, that continued in the military for a while. I was just, not doing extraordinarily stupid stuff because I had a very regimented structure around me. But what ended up happening is that that's a very good question. So this is a good story. So my mom talked about it in the podcast that she'd done that we did together. But my mother was stationed in Romania and I was stationed in England, and she was in a relationship with this man that was the love of her life, and He was involved in a head-on collision in Africa. He was visiting his daughter on a mission trip, and he was killed instantly. And my mother was going through this extremely difficult grieving process to deal with the loss of her partner at the time. And she had gone to this Romanian psychologist and was like, I need to deal with this stuff. And so he recommended that she go to. She said, "Hey, they're doing this family constellation. They're doing this workshop on trauma. Would you be willing to go?" And she was like, "I'll do whatever it takes." And so she went, and there's this Spanish man. His name is Alberto Iturbe, and his two sons, Miguel and Juan. And he is a Spanish doctor that has been trained in family constellation therapy for many years. He's one of Bert Hellinger's original students. And, she said, this is incredible. It was a week, I think, training that she had done. And she's like, this is incredible. It's very profound. So the next year, my sister had gone. My younger sister had gone because she was living in Romania at the time, working at the embassy. And she was like, this is incredible. And so when my mom and sister told me about it, I was like, okay, you guys are in a cult. You guys are crazy. So my, as you could probably tell from the podcast, we have a very humorous relationship with my family, and we're just kind of teasing each other all the time. And so she's like, hey, listen. And I was, I think, 26 at the time. I'm 40. So I was 26 at the time. I was either 25 or 26 at the time. And she's like, hey, so, they're doing this thing in Romania, and, I'll buy your ticket to come to Romania, and you can, and I'm like, I've got some friends that are in Spain. I'm going to backpack. I'll take I'll take leave from the military, and I'll backpack through Spain, and then I'll get a free ticket to Romania, and that'll be cool, So she's like, hey, listen, you can hang out in the hotel, and you can hang out in the hotel, get by the pool and stuff, and then you can go on your trip and whatever. And she knew exactly what I was doing. I'm extremely curious. And so I go to Romania, and it's in the Carpathian Mountains in Transylvania, and it's this former communist hotel, and there's bears everywhere. They're getting ready for hibernation, and there's bears just everywhere, all over the place. And it was a week-long constellation workshop with these people, and everybody spoke Romanian, and it was in Spanish. So he would translate from Spanish to Romanian. And then it was with 55 psychologists and Romanian psychologists and psychiatrists. And we did the whole thing for a full week. So just, huge themes. The Russian-Romanian War and communism. And, that resonates with my system because of Venezuela. And so, they do this representation, and I go into. Have you ever heard of or know what family constellations, what they do?
I've heard of it, and my very basic understanding is you do it with other people, and the people act out or play the parts of people in your family, and they're kind of positioned in space. But I don't know if that's right, and that's kind of all.
Yes, it is in similar way. What happens in family constellations is there's what's called the knowing field that's created, and it sounds very woo woo, but I have some resources that explain the scientific side, and there's this knowing field that's created, and people represent internal dynamics in your family system, and you're able to resolve that through this process. And you can do extraordinarily profound work in a very short period of time. So I experienced that first workshop, and I'm like, this is crazy. It works, whatever it is. I'm buying whatever this is. Like, this is interesting. This is extraordinarily interesting, and I'm going to find out where this comes from. And that's my first journey into family constellations. And I had some really difficult relationships that I was in, kind of repeating a pattern in the partners that I was choosing. And 6 months later, I met my wife, and my wife is like no other woman that I've ever dated or been around. And I've been happily married for for going on 12 years now. We have 2 beautiful kids. And so I think the proof is in the pudding in some capacity. Is that just that activation closed? That it was just no longer had that need to fulfill that pattern in my family.
What was the pattern?
Saving women. Putting women on a pedestal because of the relationship I had with my mother. That dynamic of not finding somebody that I was equal with, somebody that was above me, that had to serve, you know. So I was trying to recreate the pattern of being the child with my partners. So I was finding a mother rather than a partner. So for a partner, what kind of responsibility is that? Like, how unfair is that? Like, I'm putting all this responsibility on you to mother me. Doesn't make any sense. It's not a relationship of equals. So with my wife, I have a relationship of equals. We're partners. We're in this game together. You know, we're doing this thing us, right? And she has her strengths and weaknesses, and I have my strengths and weaknesses, and we complement each other really well, and we work on our stuff, and we work on our relationship, and we work on our, you know, our parenting, and we work on our household, and, you know, it's not perfect by any means, but it works. And so those were the relationships that I was finding myself in.
And those women, to be attracted to that dynamic, they probably had something unresolved as well, right?
100%. Yeah. So I was fulfilling a role in their lives as much as they were fulfilling a role in mine. So that's, you know, from the perspective. And so the workshops, the family constellation workshops, allowed me the opportunity to explore that in a safe environment without judgment, and deal with those issues at a very profound and primal level.
So what's an example of how you would deal with a dynamic using family constellations? Like, if I then turn up and say, I want to resolve this feeling of like abandonment,
yeah.
how would it play out with the people, and like, what would we do? So,
how
what,
it works
any
out,
example you want to use?
Yeah. So how it works out is that there may be, I'm going to give you just broad examples, right? Because every system is their own system, and I want to make sure that I don't go into your system, because we're already in a field in some capacity, so there is some subconscious communication that happens. But I'm going to use just kind of really broad, because I don't want to cross boundaries, right? I want to respect those boundaries. So, you know, for abandonment, it might be that there was a parent that was lost, or a parent that left. And so when that integration happens in the family system, and all people are put in their place, even if people passed away, even if people left, even if they were excluded from the family, even if whatever happens, everybody in the family has a place to belong, because we all come from those 4,094 people, and our siblings, alive, dead, abortions, miscarriages, everybody has a place in the family system. And have you ever seen the movie Encanto? And Disney movie Encanto?
That's the one about Bruno?
Yes. We don't talk about Bruno, right?
Yeah.
Right? You know, we don't talk about Bruno. So we don't talk about Bruno is literally talking about somebody that was excluded in the family. And the excluded ones highlight the dysfunctions in the family system. And so that's when you bring everybody back into the family system, healing can happen. And what healing looks like is counterintuitive. Healing looks like we no longer participate in dynamics that do not serve us. Right? So that might be like deep fights with a parent. Long, prolonged fights with parents, or like not talking to them for long periods of time. And these dynamics that I find myself always in this pattern that, you know, my parent wants me to take care of them. It's like, I'm not your parent. I'm the child. You're the big one. I'm the little one. So those are the dynamics that we're talking about, is like to heal the family systems and acknowledge and uncover the hidden dynamics in the family system, and simply acknowledge them, and they dissipate in their strength.
And that happens just by witnessing, kind of putting these other people who are representing these,
Correct,
like, in space, or even like
yes.
with the meditation we began with, that it's like,
so the meditation is a version of that. And just like your internal picture, just reframing your internal picture from your individual unit, to say, I'm connected to my parents, and my parents are connected to their parents, and their parents, and so on and so forth. And I have all these people behind me supporting me. Just reframing that and putting everybody in their place is a small movement towards healing, if that makes sense. Because the trauma creates, let's say somebody died early, right? A father was, in an accident. Just the loss of that is like your parent is still there in the meta sense. Does that make sense? Because there's the us that are right here, but there's the meta us, right? The ideal of us, the us that's in our minds and in our souls. And that meta us, everybody has their place. And those hidden dynamics guide our lives on a regular basis. And so if we're taking the position of a parent, or we're taking the position of our parent's parent, or we're taking the position of a uncle that was excluded because that uncle was, that uncle was rejected from the family. We out of loyalty to our family system, out of this unconscious pattern, we repeat these things, and we try to highlight them in order to heal.
And so what was your path then so you were still in the military when you did that workshop in Romania?
Yep. So I was still in the military when I was doing that work in Romania, and then I shortly there met my wife. We started dating, and then I'm starting. This starts my entrepreneur journey, and I was like, this work's incredible. I'm going to be doing this for more than likely the rest of my life. It deeply resonated with who I am. And so I was still in the military and going about my life. And I started a business so my grandfather passed away. And he was are you familiar with hospice care, palliative care? So my grandfather was in hospice care, and I designed and patented a shirt for hospice patients. And I tried to launch the business, and it didn't work out. I left the military, so I separated from the military to pursue that. And I had a group of investors that were here in the South Florida area, and I got my rear end handed to me. It was just it didn't work out, right? It was my first kind of failed venture in business, and that same family, and they were wealthy Venezuelan family, and that same family owned a car dealership here in South Florida. So I went into that business. They had some difficulties with the business, and I was able to work with that. And then my business partner right now, that project wrapped up, and my business partner right now asked me to come on board I run an IT company. We do IT services for car dealerships. So I do that on my that's my day job, as they would say. I run that company. And in parallel, I've been doing this discovery of work, and I found my life mission. And my life mission is to help as many people deal with unresolved trauma as possible, through guided meditations, through workshops, through writing about my experience, through doing podcasts. I host a podcast called the Zulu One Podcast on unresolved trauma and family systems, and that's all I talk about. I'm a one-trick pony, and I look at things through that lens of unresolved trauma, and I try to understand the world through that lens. It might be kind of a binary way to do things, but I think that there's a lot of information that can be pulled out of simple understanding of systems. And so over the past, for 2008 is when I did my first constellation to 2023. I've experienced many modalities of this work, from the traditional family constellations to shamanic constellations to structural constellations to There's a huge variety of what this modality provides. And so kind of the mission of Zulu One is to provide as much opportunity for people to heal as possible, and with conversations like this.
And do you find the balance works with your day job, your family, and this work?
The beautiful hidden secret gem of this is the more that you work on your crap, the more things work around you. That's it. Like the world around you shows up like you present yourself to it. And so I found that the more that I work on myself as a leader, the more that I work on myself as a husband, the more I work on myself as a father, the better my life is. And that's, I know that comes from a position that I'm privileged to be able to do that, but it wasn't always the case. It's just a momentum that I started building, 15 years ago. And, it was that. And I work with a lot of people in this healing journey, and it's my life mission. I'm going to do it until the day that I die. I know that for sure, because it's just so rewarding. It's so rewarding to see people, step into their place and step into their power and not carry things that don't belong to them. It's just such a catastrophe to see people repeating patterns that don't belong to them out of loyalty to their family system. And it's beautiful. You see people after years that they've been doing this stuff, and they're just in a complete different place. When, depression might have been following a sibling to death, right? Or they could have been, that they were dealing with abuse or whatever that looks like. And it's really powerful, and it's beautiful work.
Yeah, I feel very strongly about this. This is why I think as soon as I saw that unresolved trauma, I think you wrote something about it being our biggest liability. It just resonated so much. And then I think that's when we started talking, when I was like, how do you said something about quantifying it? Because it's like, this is like some truth that I just feel like, it's like an intuitive thing when someone's talking and you're like, they're not talking out of that rational sense. There's so much like anger or emotion or something like buried. And it just resonates that it's like, yes, this is a thing. But I know at the same time, a lot of people, particularly men, but just like I've always been in finance or whatever. I have brothers. I'm like, feel like I live in this kind of more like masculine logic world. And so I'm very sensitive to anything that could be like spiritual or like woo-woo or not backed up by, I guess, because I as well am like studied engineering, whatever. So it's like, when you mentioned quantifying this and then sent me something that it's like, oh my God, this is amazing if we can, because it's just like some people need to, it's even like with the ancestral trauma, people will like dismiss it, but then when you can show the studies and like use the scientific method to show some of these things, then suddenly you have more of an audience from people who would just dismiss that stuff. Even who you are, like, because if it's like, oh, I'm talking to like a therapist or something, people can, but it's like, oh, like ex-military person, then like a different type of person will respond.
Thank you for saying that, because that's my favorite part about this, is that I was very much, I'll respect somebody's crystals. You know what I mean? Like, okay, sure. If you want to light some stuff and some crystals, go, to each their own. It's like, I'm very, very agnostic when it comes to things like that. And it took me years to figure out, I'm like, okay, so there's something here and it doesn't make sense. I need to understand it, because if I can understand it, I can explain it. And, what's happened now is, I think that as we're creating density in systems, we can start understanding this phenomenon. So, are you familiar with Nicholas Christakis? So Nicholas Christakis is a sociologist from Yale, and he found this phenomenon called the widower effect. And I'm going to paraphrase because I'm terrible about remembering these things, but I'll give you the gist of it. Is that, kind of the information that are in social fields. And what he says is that if there's a partner, long-term partners, right, that if one of the partners dies, the probability of the partner dying in the next 2 to 3 years is about 50%. If I recall correctly, it's about 50%. But it doesn't necessarily only happen with the partner. It happens with the best friend, with a close cousin, with the sister, it happens in the whole cluster of information, right? The full data cluster. So they use computer models to quantify these systems. So it talks about an additional layer of communication or an additional layer of resonance that happens between close systems. And so I'm, one of your countrymen, Rupert Sheldrake, talks about this. And he in the scientific society and community is a pariah. But I think as things are moving forward in this world, we're starting to understand larger systems. And I think AI is going to have a huge input in what this looks like because the evidence of it is going to be undeniable. And every day there's more and more peer-reviewed papers that are talking about these social systems or trauma in social systems. Thomas Hubel, Alexander Wendt, Katsuma Matoba as well, in Germany, are working on these collective unresolved trauma and systems, and I believe they're using quantum morphic fields to understand where that's coming from. And I'm extraordinarily out of my depth when I talk about these things, but I'm looking at it from an amateur perspective. Saying, oh, this is interesting. This is explaining a little bit about what I've always had suspicions of. And, many people talk about, they're like the quantum world, and it's where woo-woo comes from. It's like, okay. I understand. I see that perspective. I acknowledge it, but it doesn't necessarily resonate with me. But I think as we're progressing in this stuff, we're going to understand the mystery of where this comes from. And I really, it resonates when you say that you're an engineer, that you have an engineering background and you come from logic, because I think that the path through this mystery is through logic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then with your IT business. So I'm interested in this because I feel like, so I work in finance. That's my job. But I feel so strongly about like this podcast and having these type of conversations. And it's hard to explain, but it's just something that I feel like I have to do. And it's some kind of like uncovering truth thing or like, following my curiosity. But it kind of feels like now this is the balance, at least for the moment, that it's like to work in a job that, is like nothing to do with this, but gives me some kind of other, stability and other fulfillment and uses my brain in, because like I work like working with numbers and whatever. And that, but for a while I was lost because it was kind of like this stuff feels so different. It also feels very scary to do. Especially to speak openly, right? When some corporate, there's pressure on organizations to have like political views, and it's like, is it, okay to be in a place? And even you asking me like, can you swear on this? And I'm like, yeah, you can. This is a place to, because I share those values about free speech and freedom of religion and all that. It's like,
yeah.
But anyway, but that now feels like, okay, this is why, and that's what, Anyway, but I'm wondering how does that work for you, having like an IT business and then also doing this work, and how does
so
it balance?
I'm very direct, and I talk about it. I was like, listen, if you're gonna work with me, or I can't put this genie back in the bottle. I refuse to. It's who I am. and I cannot not look at things through this lens. So it's not religious for me because it's not a faith-based kind of thing. It's an evidence-based thing for me. It's like maybe experiential and anecdotal, yes. But, that's what business is. It's like, hey, when I go here, it works. And I'm going to keep going down here. That's how business works, right? It's that lean methodology of keep, doing hypothesis, deploy, and then feedback, and you do that loop as fast as possible. That's how effective business leaders run businesses, right? It's like you're not making these huge hypotheses. You get feedback from the field and understand what people are talking about, and then you keep the business running on that, and you pivot on a dime and move forward and survive COVID and survive, work from home and survive the changing landscape and threats from cyber attackers. Like everything that you have to do has to be this, just be in an open vessel. And whatever makes me a more open vessel is what I'm going to do as a business leader. So I think it's in some capacity a superpower that to have to say, the more I take away my crap, the more I take away my trauma, the more I can be connected to my team, the more I can be connected to myself, the more I can be connected to my intuition, and the better leader in business I'll be running. So there is something called systemic immunity or systemic resistance that that there will be some type of repercussions in some way of things attacking this, but it's to be expected, right? There's this really great leader that talks about organizational systemic leadership. His name is Jan Jacob Stam, and has done this organizational systemic work for the largest Dutch telecom, Mercedes-Benz, for BMW, the government of Brazil. So it's becoming much less woo-woo and more into the phenomenological, but that people understand. I mean, well, most people don't understand how psychology works, but there's industrial psychology. It is something that's wildly accepted in organizations. And so I use that as an advantage. And I think that the world belongs to those that can work on their crap.
And I guess because you love doing this work so much, it doesn't feel like exhausting to be managing it as well.
Yeah. I feel deeply called to it. Yeah. It's a blessing, so it really is a blessing for it. And I think that everybody around me and myself benefit from this journey. My kids are thriving. My relationship with my wife is solid. We have a beautiful, harmonious home. We've never had a blowout, drag-out fight. We argue and we discuss things and, passionately discuss our points, but it's never been, catastrophic. And there's never been volatility. There's always been very stable and a place where you can have solid footing to be able to succeed. So I think it's this weird superpower. It's I don't know how else to put it,
Is your wife American as well?
Yes, my wife's American, yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add, or can I ask you the last 3 questions?
Go for it.
How do you stay grounded?
Breathing and my guided meditations. I always try to remember to breathe. Like that somebody said, I listen to a lot of military podcasts, and they're talking to this guy that was in Mogadishu in the battle in Somalia, and he goes, PTSD and has a lot of trauma, or PTS as they would say, and has a lot of trauma. And he says, go back to the basics, breathe, just breathe. And I do that with my daughter and my son a lot. When they're losing their minds, I just say, take a deep breath, take another deep breath, take another deep breath, and just breathe through and let the emotion exist. So breathing is one, and then the guided meditation that we started with is another tool that I use.
How often do you do it?
It depends. So I have about 34, 36 guided meditations, and I use them for different times. I have that the beginning one, I do it often. I don't meditate every day. I'm far from that, but I use it when I need it, and I use it as a tool. It's not a habit; it's just a tool for me. So my wife and I will meditate, and I'll put it on. It's 5-minute meditation. It's not, it's not this long-term, Vipassana commitment that you're going to be in silence for 10 days. It's just literally 5 minutes, right? So, if you don't have 5 minutes to meditate, you don't have 5 minutes for anything. It's kind of my philosophy. So I do it often enough to use it as an effective tool in my family.
Is there a book that has had a big influence on your life?
I read Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference 7 times in a row.
Wow, I
didn't
have that
read
book.
it.
I just started reading it.
Yeah, I didn't read it. I listened to it because I listen to books. I listened to it 7 times in a row. So Chris Voss, practically, I'm extraordinarily practical. From a practical sense, just to how to understand, to communicate with people, and to make sure that people feel heard, and that I'm actually communicating with people. That book was instrumental in that. And then there's a book by Mark Wolin in the family constellation world that it popularized family constellations, and it's called "It Didn't Start With You," and that book was really instrumental. Mark, I know I met Mark before, and I've done constellation with him, and he's a brilliant man, and it's very popular, and it's a very good book to understand where family constellations come from.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's my prompt to go and read it, as well as to keep doing the work. That's the strong message I'm getting from this conversation.
Good.
Okay. Last question. Which 3 words describe the best version of you?
Connected, kind. I don't know if right-sized is one word, but right-sized.
Amazing. Okay, and Chris Voss, sorry, by the way, for people who don't know what that is, he's a hostage negotiator, right?
Yes, FBI hostage negotiator, yeah.
But it's like helpful to understand negotiations.
Yeah, because I think
People in
it's...
general.
Yeah, understanding yourself is so much of that, because, I'm extraordinarily practical. If I'm one thing, I'm really practical. And it just gives you practical understanding of being like, okay, in a very understandable way, it's just like, stop and see where this is coming from, and take 2 seconds. Like the time between disaster and connection is like a millisecond. Just take that millisecond and be like, wait, does this belong to me or does it not belong to me? Is this talking from a different place, or am I talking from am I talking from me, or am I talking from a different place? Just to take that split second is just, most people don't. And that's his thought, not mine.
And that also ties into IFS, which I'm a bit obsessed with, which is the part therapy. It's like, is this
Yes.
from myself, or is this from a part, like a wounded part trapped in the past, or a protector part? Or...
Yes. Yeah. I don't know how much IFS has to do with constellations. I know there's some overlap, and I know it's a very powerful modality, and I confess I don't know much about IFS, but I know it has a lot of similarities to constellation, to the family system dynamics.
I feel like the name both the names can be like confusing and daunting for people because they immediately think, wait, does this mean family therapy? I have to get in the room with my family? Like, I'm not going to do that. And it's like, no.
Yeah. Yeah, and most people with constellation be like, what do you mean, like astrology? I'm like, yeah, I know. yeah, no, they think it's astrology and, you know, like, oh, I'm a Virgo or I'm a, you know, Gemini or whatever that looks like. And it's like, yeah, it doesn't do that at all.
Interesting. Okay, so if someone wants to know more about your work, or where do they find the meditations, or if they want to learn more about this type of therapy, where should they go?
So the main page is Zulu1.org. That's ZULUONE.org. And the podcast is on there. The guided meditations is on there. Information about family constellations is on there as well. And, you know, you can find the podcast on all the major podcast providers out there. And the meditations are mainly on YouTube. So if you put in Zulu One Podcast, the meditations will show up. And then I'm on social media. I'm on Twitter, on Instagram, and you can connect with me there. Yeah.
Where does the name come from?
That's a great question. So that has a couple different connotations. So Zulu is universal time, right? The meridian of Greenwich, which is British, just ends up being, you know, time in England. And then Zulu is very much in the military, right? Because I was in the military, Zulu is usually that's Zulu time is universal time. But also Bert Hellinger took or learned a lot of information from the Zulu tribe in South Africa about the spiritual connections. And Dan Cohen has the saying that it was very much about, you know, I can't remember exactly what the saying is, but the saying basically goes that in Bert Hellinger's understanding of the Zulu tribe in Africa was more of the hunter becoming the hunted and really being taken by their, you know, he was a Catholic priest that was there for you know, missionary trips. And he was he ran a school in South Africa, and it was really very much of the Zulu tribal beliefs impregnated him with these ideas of unity, Ubuntu, collective consciousness, and restitution of family order and family systems. So very much it's an homage and honoring the roots of this work with the Zulu tribe of South Africa. And then one is that we have this one collective consciousness, right? That we are interconnected and we come from one interconnected system of knowing, and we're all representations of that one collective consciousness. So that's where the name comes from.
And I guess if you follow that, you know, line of ancestry back far enough, you find that we all came from the same place on the savannah.
Yep. There's a beautiful exercise that we do with in family constellations where we put 12 generations in a line, and we put the original ancestor that you would some people would call God, source, the universe, the original ancestor, that one place that we all come from, that we can all trace our lineage back to. And it's such a powerful exercise to, you know, do the movement with that presence in the workshops. It's really beautiful.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, John.
It has been great getting to know you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and courage during this journey.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, feel free to share it with someone. And also, a random 23-year-old just messaged me on Instagram and told me he found the podcast through the algorithm. So it actually does help if you review the podcast and subscribe or follow. And then you get to find out about future episodes as well. Review or rate, you know what I mean. Anyway, it would truly make my day. So thank you in advance.